Welcome back to Voices of the West. Today we have the joy of talking to author Paul Colt, who is a multi-award winner for everything from the Spur Awards to the tell us a little bit about yourself. We'll get into all of the detail because you've got so many things I'm afraid to list them all at once.
Well, I started writing probably 16 years ago now. Um, in the back end of a business career, I always thought I'd write a book. Um, didn't think much about fiction uh, early on, but I had a very active imagination as a kid. And somewhere in my late 50s, I found out I still had it. So I got an idea for a series, and it happened to have a Western historical context to it, events that occurred in and around the events of Ulysses S. Grant's presidency. And, they say, write what you know. And so I grew up from knee high to a tall guy riding horses and working with them, knew which end of the horse the oats went in and where they came out. And I thought, well, Westerns kind of suited my personality, like many in my age group. I grew up on Westerns, so it felt very much at home to start that.
Very good. What do you think makes a great Western?
Well, it for me, it isn't so much the classic Western because I really don't do that. I do historical uh, novels and historical dramatizations where, for me, my goal is I want to entertain, yes, but I also want to inform. We don't teach history that much anymore. It's unfortunate, but I think it's largely true. And so when I tackle a historical story, I want that historical aspect to come out. I want the history to be as accurate as I can make it, which, as you noted earlier, that there's a lot of research that goes into one of my historical novels, and that's sort of the start point for anything that I do.
Well, you got the big jump there of trying to make history come alive and become realistic and everything. And you're taking on Bat Masterson, of all people, amongst your assorted books in there. And he's about as over the top, larger than life as you can get.
Yeah, the thing about the Friends Call Me Bat that attracted me to it is that he's not that well known as a character. There's not been a lot of stuff written about him, and I thought, he would be an interesting person to take a whack at a biographical novel. So that was my first foray into biographical novels. And what I found in Bat is a fascinating character who was his life story reads like a who's who in the West, but most people don't know all the ins and outs of what he did. They'll know a little bit about what happened in Dodge City and that he and Wyatt Earp were friends, and that's about as far as it typically goes. For example, in the Second Battle of Adobe Walls, he was there as a buffalo hunter. I had no idea when I started researching the thing. And then this is the classic example of where the research takes you. So when I got the idea for the book, I thought, okay, here's how we're going to approach it. Bat Masterson ended his life as a sports writer in New York. Most people, again, don't know that. And so what I envisioned was a starstruck Cub reporter working alongside of him, convincing him to tell his story. And so I started the research, and lo and behold, the cub reporter started out to me as going to be a fictional character. Started writing, researching the book, and turns out he did have a friend, a fellow reporter, who was always after him to reveal his story. And that friend of Bats was none other than Damon Runyon. And in researching Damon Runyon, then for part of his part in the book, I learned that uh, his lead character in Guys and Dolls, which is the play he's most noted for, Nathan Detroit, is based on Bat Masterson. You can't make this stuff up. And so it was a fascinating journey, and a book that got some spur recognition, which I'm proud of. I like all my books, but there are some of them that stand out. And Bat and I got to be good friends in the course of writing that thing. And it's a little bit like getting in character for a role as an actor. See, the second part of this fusion writing style of mine after the research is the scene setting and the dialogue writing, which is closer akin to screenwriting, frankly, than a traditional Western is. And so I'm a big fan of good dialogue, true grit. Charles Portis's dialogue in that film or in that book translated to film twice, and both of the directors chose to use his dialogue almost word for word. So when you've got a good character voice, then I think you can make these historical dramatizations work and work credibly. Sometimes it's difficult. Boots and Saddles, A Call to Glory was my book on an early chapter in George Patton's career that most people don't know about. And here was the challenge with that one. For most of us, George Patton is George C. Scott's iconic interpretation of
Very
him.
true. Yes.
And so, if you're going to create that young George Patton, you better honor the character that Scott created for us. And that was an interesting challenge as well.
Where do you get your inspiration for these? Do you just find it from, oh, this looks like an interesting historical event? Do you find the characters that you want to try and pursue? What starts the seed of a novel for you?
Good question. And they come at me from a variety of different places. Take Boots and Saddles, for example. I was reading, one of the authors I admire is Jeff Shaara, who writes historical dramatizations, often set in the Civil War, also World War II. And I was reading Shaara's book, Steel Wave, which was a story of the Normandy invasion. And at the time that they were planning the Normandy invasion, Patton had got himself crosswise with Montgomery specifically, whose ego was easily gotten out of joint. And so Eisenhower, in deference to Monty, instead of giving Patton command of the invasion, which Patton thought he deserved, he shipped him up to the north of England with a cardboard army to convince German intelligence that the invasion was coming at Calais in the north of France as opposed to Normandy. Well, so I'm reading Shaara's book, and in that segment of the book where he's talking about Patton, he drops a throwaway line that said Patton went into Mexico with Pershing chasing Pancho Villa in 1919. And I thought, whoa, Patton, Pershing, Villa in this dusty corner of history that most folks don't know about, I think there might be a book in there. 3 years later, we had Boots and Saddles, A Call to Glory. So
Outstanding.
that's an example of how they come about. But the Bad Masterson book appealed to me is because of the character, and he was little known and his exploits were little known. One that I just it's in the chute, going through the publishing process right now, is a book I call Lunger, which is the Doc Holliday story, and same premise there. Biographical novel, character everybody knows a bit about, nobody knows a lot about, and so it provided a really interesting research perspective, because I had three choices to triangulate him as a character, all of which came at it from a different perspective. There was a family biography that Old South dignified antebellum family wanted their family name unsullied by Doc's activities.
Valdosta, Georgia, in the proper viewpoint. Yes.
Right. And then you had Big Nose Kate, with whom he had a tempestuous, long-standing relationship, and she had a perspective on him from nonfiction point of view with one of Chris Enz's books. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, his relationship with Wyatt, which is the most commonly known, but you can go back at Doc from all three of those triangulation points, and you find a different slant on the same character that hopefully comes together in a composite that reveals him as a character more so than just the gunfight at the OK Corral.
You're trying to hit up all the lesser known amongst all the those, but you've hit two of my number one heroes already on these. So I'm definitely buying the Doc Holliday when it comes out. No question about that one. I have a huge collection of them here. So definitely appreciate that. What else do you think is the most underdeveloped or underexposed part of the Old West? Kind of goes to where your next book's going.
Oh, well, the next one is, right now I'm kind of scratching for what that next one's going to look like, having just finished Lunger. I think a different take on the question that might be kind of interesting is the controversial parts of the West. And there I would kind of point back to my Bounty trilogy, which is a treatment of the Lincoln County War and Billy the Kid's outlaw adventures. And in the third book in that series, A Question of Bounty, I poke at the controversy over whether Pat Garrett really killed him or not. And not from the vantage point of, the Brushy Bill Roberts story that was claimed in the 30s, and that kind of went by the boards. Or even Garrett's book. Garrett's book is the accepted history, The Authentic Life of Billy the Kid, as it was entitled. But I stumbled on another version of those events told by a guy named John Poe, who was Garrett's deputy, who was on the scene that night. And he left a memoir. And his memoir and Garrett's book don't agree. And they don't agree on what to me was a fairly material, circumstantial fact about who went into Pete Maxwell's house July 14th in the middle of the night, in what sequence. So I took Poe's book, laid it down beside Garrett's book, and then worked from there and ended up finding a guy named John Miller, who most people don't know about. He died in the Pioneer Nursing Home in Prescott, Arizona in the 30s again. A guy who went to his grave denying that he was Billy the Kid. But if you take all of the circumstances of John Miller, who dropped onto the planet for all record keeping that's possible, about 3 weeks after Garrett killed the kid. So taking that story, piecing it all together from those disparate sources, stirred up a little controversy. I mean, there are some shirt-tailed Garrett kin that took great offense to the notion that maybe he didn't kill Billy the Kid. So yeah, those are the kinds of stories that obviously get my juices flowing, as you might be able to tell, and so that's what I look for.
Very good. How do you feel the Western market is changing? And what
Well,
are readers looking for?
all of us who are great fans of it, grew up on it, are all getting a little long in the tooth. So we really need, I think, to appeal to a younger audience, if we can. It's not easy to do, but the third part of my fusion writing style is, after the research and after the screenwriting visualization notions and dialogue notions, the third one is the way I hang a plot together. A typical Western is a very serial, a monofilament, if you will. It's got a beginning, a middle, and an end, and it goes from one to the other, one through the second to the third. My books tend to have 2 or 3 plot lines weaving back and forth during the story. So it puts the Western story or the historical story together in the same kind of construct that an action adventure writer puts together action adventure stories. And I probably would have liked to have been an action adventure writer, but I didn't have enough tradecraft to be convincing as one of those guys. But I like the style. It's fast paced, and that pacing, I think, really broadens the appeal of my stories relative to some others.
Definitely. And the fact that you're starting from historical means that one way or the other, it's going to have an appeal to people across time, no matter what. It's not like you're just trying to put out, a cowboy in a guitar rides out into the cactus area and starts singing and playing things, something outdated 1950s television type thing like that. You're talking
Although I kind of, this is retro. I like that retro stuff. It probably doesn't sell very well anymore, but the horses did run fast.
Yes, they did.
Frames per second is fast.
There definitely is room for I guess, the younger audiences and such. I'm saying that being that I still consider myself someone who was brought up on Westerns, even though I'm like, I guess the younger generation of those things coming together. But it's trying to appeal to people who are looking for the fast and the, I guess, more action filmy kind of thing. They're looking for things on film. They're not looking for things in books. Right. But history always ties to people who are interested in what came before them.
Yeah.
And making those live and human, that'll appeal to anybody always.
Yeah, and I think the pacing, I think pacing, you did an interview not long ago with a friend of mine, Rod Miller.
Yes.
And Rod, gave a review for one of my books, for Roundup, the Western Writers magazine. And Rod gave a book a good review, but he made a comment. He said, the pacing took a little getting used to. And this back and forth fast pacing of multiple plot lines is different from a Western perspective. And I've thought about it. I might do better in some of the Western writing competitions than I do, although I've had some success. But I might do better if I wrote a more traditional style. But here's the dirty little secret: my readers like it. They like the fast pace. So hey, at the end of the day, they're the key to the whole thing.
This is
And
true. They
I'll
keep us
keep
all
writing.
employed.
I'll keep writing for their preferences.
Very good. Um, when you go into research, how long do you spend researching a particular book before you decide, okay, enough, time to write? Or
It
does that
depends
ever
on the
stop?
book. Depends on the book. My last one that came out late last year, the Carol Padre. Um, it was it. I spent 5 years working on that book, and there's a message in there too about research that you correctly identify the fact there's a point at which enough is enough and you stop. So what happened? Why did Vaquero Padre take 5 years? Well, a typical historical novel for me it's a 3-year enterprise, a year to research it, a year to write it, and then a year for the publisher to do their thing. Vaquero Padre, I thought I had a first draft. Okay. And then I went to a Western Writers Convention in Tucson, Arizona, and sat on a panel that dealt with the principle in that book, which is a Jesuit priest, Eusebio Kino, who was a missionary to the Pima Indians in the Southwest, Western United States and Northern Mexico. And, and I bumped into a expert, actually a couple of experts on his life, because one of his missions is in Tucson.
Yes, nice.
And they said, you really need to get this book. Written by a guy named Herbert Bolton, published in 1936. Okay. And I got Bolton's book, and guess what? I had to start over. I had to start over because there were, you're dealing in the 17th century. So, that's back there a ways. And even though Kino left a journal that I was able to get, not the original clearly, but get a pre-printed version of it, it's very confusing, very confusing. And Bolton walked the miles that Kino rode, and uh, and so I literally had to start over. And finding the right research sources is really pretty key. Like Poe's memoir in Question of Bounty. One of my earliest books, first one really, Grasshoppers in Summer, is a story of the making and breaking of the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868. And I that had its roots in that original grant idea that I had. And when I got through with sketching out those 3 books, all of a sudden I realized there's a deeper story inside it. And it was Grasshoppers in Summer. So I pulled all that out of those 3 books, and then wrote what got some Will Rogers medallion recognition, as a balanced treatment of that series of events, because it's written from the perspective of the political, military, and tribal leaders of the time. And so it's been a great book for me. And then about a year ago, I stumbled on a book called Black Elk Speaks, which is another book written in the 30s about a Lakota mystic uh, who told stories about the religious stories and aspects of the Lakota culture, which, had I had that research source when I wrote Grasshoppers, it would have added a whole nother dimension to the book. So it's finding that right source for information. And sometimes you find them in obscure places like the 30s.
A lot of people that were interviewing and writing books on people who lived through everything at that point that, yeah, they don't necessarily get a lot of reading these days on things, but there's a lot of stuff out there that's great for information.
Yeah, yeah.
What would be the most valuable piece of advice that you would give to someone for writing, particularly
To
aspiring authors?
who's starting or is somewhere down the road?
Um, the starting out to the just kind of beginning to try and find their feet kind of phase.
Well, I can go back to probably 2004, when I got that first book in the Grant series to the point, and I thought, I'm ready to go pitch this to somebody. And I stumbled on the Western Writers of America website. And lo and behold, there were contacts on that website for some of these published Western writers. So I shot an email to half a dozen of them. And I introduced myself and I said, I'm a wannabe, and I've got this book and any words of wisdom. Four of them came back to me, said, send me a chapter or two or whatever. I did. And all four of them came back to me with politely worded versions of not ready for prime time. I had the storytelling in me. I didn't have the writing craft in me yet. One of those guys was a gentleman by the name of Dusty Richards. And Dusty Richards said to me, he didn't know me from Adam, but he said to me, rewrite it. And here's what I want you to do. Boom, 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 boom. Okay. So I rewrote it. And for a year, Dusty and I went back and forth until he finally crammed the craft between my ears. And I I tell anyone anytime I get the chance to acknowledge Dusty that he made a writer out of a storyteller. He passed away a couple of years ago, and the genre is a lot poorer for the loss of Dusty. But because of what he did for me, I've been known to help wannabes and to this is a longer answer to your question than you probably wanted, but to boil it down into the three things that I can tell a new writer before I ever pick up that first chapter they've written. Simple sentence, present tense, active voice, and if you don't remember what those mean, run, don't walk to the nearest grammar book and practice, because that's where you make a story readable. And so that's the word of advice. That, and I think I would agree with what Rod said not long ago. Read. You have to read. I find I'm still learning about the craft of writing by reading others who are accomplished at it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It is a lifelong journey to be I don't know if one is ever properly crafted writer, but it's something you always keep at.
Yeah, yeah.
So where do we learn more about your books and what's out, what's coming out? Where do people start with reading your books?
Well, the historical novels are all standalone. Where the Bounty trilogy is a trilogy. The historical novels are all standalone. I have a series. I call it the Great Western Detective League series that has a historical spine to it, but I allow myself a whole lot more fictional license with that series than with most. And those are books with a set of cast of characters that's a continuity from one title to the next. There are four books out in series now. 5 is on the way, and there'll be a 6th. So they're a little bit shorter, kind of beach read sort of stuff that I do between the big historical novels. There's 15 titles out there, all totaled right now. The logical place to start is Amazon, search at Paul Colt, author, and you'll land on my author page, or you can go on Facebook at Paul Colt, author, with a search, and you'll land on my author page on Facebook. And there's about 10,000 folks who follow my weekly posts on that. And the marketing gimmick in those posts is each starts with a tease line on Facebook. You click a link to get to the rest of the post, and it appears on my Amazon author page. I don't know how that happens. So those are the two places I would say, Amazon or Facebook. I don't have a website. I did for probably 8 or 10 years. Nobody ever went there. So I rely on Amazon and Facebook for all my marketing.
They definitely work very well for things and let people be seen. And with 10,000 people following you, that's not a bad thing for that.
No, it took a while to get there, but I've got some good friends on my Facebook page who we interact weekly.
So you like to interact with your readers, and
oh yeah,
that's a beautiful thing.
My posts get comments on Facebook, and I make a point of responding to every one of them. Sometimes it gets a little hectic. I had one series, been doing this for about 10 years, and I one series of posts, the only one that I've ever repeated, but it was a series on the code of the West, or the cowboy code, as some people call it. And to the point we were talking about earlier about young people, that post twice that I ran it was the single most widely read of any that I've ever put up. I had over 60,000 reads on that series twice. And the reason is because that code of values speaks to what those of us whose kids are grown and are looking at our grandkids would like to leave those values to those coming behind us. And that's where all that interest was. It was passing those insights on to younger people. Whether any of them turned into Western readers or not, I don't know. But it was pretty gratifying to see the response to that particular series.
Absolutely. That's a very good response for anything online to run that way. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I appreciate you taking the time to be able to come and talk to us.
Happy to do it, Nick. Enjoyed.
I'm looking forward to your Doc Holliday book coming out.
All right. Hopefully by December, if we're lucky.
Very good. I will keep an eye out. And again, I appreciate you coming through here and talking with us today.
All right, Nick. Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you.